Denise Gwen, reading aloud for you from my novel, His Christmas Eve Proposal, Book 3 of The Medicine Women of Alaska, Chapter 38. It surprised Drew that he'd made it to Anchorage in one long drive. Normally, he'd stop at several places to take a rest break from the fatigue of climbing over the steep terrain and navigating the winding roads. He had no memory of the drive itself. He'd been deep in thought and struggling with his feelings of confusion. He focused his thoughts entirely on Naomi, berating himself as to where he went wrong. How had he failed to persuade her to stay? It hurt. It really hurt. He pulled up into the parking lot of Anchorage Memorial Hospital and saw it filled to capacity with news vans, news anchors, and camera people. Well, he should have expected this. After all, the entire Velasquez family was there keeping a vigil over Ricardo Velasquez. He had no knowledge as to whether Ricardo had recovered or was going to die. Ricardo Velasquez. Okay, he knew this name. Naomi had been engaged to this fellow. He'd been listening to the radio on his way over to Anchorage, and he'd listened to the broadcasts about Ricardo and his glamorous persona. The playboy son of Dr. Hermano Velasquez and the nephew to Vittorio. Drew couldn't make any sense of it. How in the world did Naomi ever get herself involved in a family like this one? He simply couldn't see Naomi with someone like Velasquez. His thoughts drifted to Naomi, and as he navigated the treacherous terrain, he came to a decision. He'd follow Naomi wherever she went. Sure, he loved the people of Gnometown. He loved being in daily contact with his brother and forming a part of a community that meant so much to him. He was carrying on a medical practice that his grandfather had started and which his father had carried on for him and for which Drew was now carrying on the family tradition. But he'd only joined his father's practice under duress. And as time passed, he'd grown to love Gnometown and the people of the village. And yet, he was willing to give it all up to follow the woman he loved to wherever she landed. For if he didn't, he'd watch yet another woman walk out of his life. Still musing, he walked into the hospital and approached the information desk. He asked for Dr. Paul Rutherford and was directed to the ICU. He took the stairs 2 at a time, flung open the door to the 7th floor, and burst out onto the corridor. He walked past a doctor standing at the nurse's station. He couldn't allow Naomi to give up something that formed a part of her soul. Drew, is that you? He whirled around and stared in shocked surprise. Danielle. He didn't know what to do or say. He didn't recognize her, quite frankly. He'd walked right past her. Hello, Danielle. He stuck out his hand for a handshake, and she at first moved to hug him, but then appeared to think better of it and accepted his hand. How are you? He asked. I'm fine, she said. Paul said to keep an eye out for you. Oh, did he, eh? Paul and she used to exchange barbs that grew in animosity. How did Paul react to seeing his ex-sister-in-law after all these years? Paul had probably handled it better than he had. Yes, and he's been keeping vigil over Ricardo Velasquez ever since he left the surgery. That's my brother. he said with admiration. Did he insert the chest tube? She asked. No, he didn't. You did? No, I didn't either. Well, she said with a mirthless smile, that chest tube didn't insert itself, so who did insert it? And now it was coming back to him. The memories of what he'd disliked so much about his former wife, her tendency toward sarcasm. Dr. Naomi Schuster, he said, hoping not to betray his feelings for her in front of his ex-wife. Oh, she said. Yes. And then he added, unnecessarily, she's one of the finest surgeons I know, but she's leaving Gnometown. Oh, Danielle said. Well, her administration of that procedure up on the mountain was textbook perfect. She saved Mr. Velasquez's life. She tapped her chin thoughtfully. So, yet another young doctor leaving Gnometown. Don't go there, Danielle. We've got a hotel and spa coming soon. Yes, thanks to the Velasquez millions. All the same, Drew, Gnometown is still a backwater. Okay, Danielle, that's enough. He couldn't believe it. They were stumbling down the same rabbit hole of anger and recriminations that sent his marriage into divorce. And Gnometown itself will never change, she interjected. Yes, and I love it there, and you'll never change, Drew, she added triumphantly. He closed his eyes and took a long moment to recollect himself and his thoughts. When he opened his eyes again, Danielle looked frightened. Clearly, she'd recognized that she'd gone too far. Danielle, he said evenly, I'm surprised to see you here. I thought you were heading to Nebraska. Yes, well, I'm glad you found a place where you're happy. She opened her mouth as if to say more, then closed it. Thank you, Drew. It was good seeing you, he said evenly. He then turned on his heel and walked toward the ICU. She'd been baiting him. Heaven only knew why. But he refused to descend to her level of anger. For whatever reason, she still felt the need to do so even now, but he refused to take the bait. And yes, it was true. He hadn't changed for Danielle, but life had given him another chance with Naomi. He was determined not to blow it. He reflected on his exchange with Danielle. He no longer felt anger toward her. Regret, yes. He supposed he'd always regret the mistakes that he'd made. But seeing her in person did not trigger the old angry memories. He'd worked through it and could speak pleasantly to her and genuinely wish her well in her own life. Not only had he forgiven her for the breakup of their marriage, but he'd forgiven himself.